Welcome to another edition of Don Hammond's Arlington Weekly News. We have a slightly unusual lineup this week. News, coverage of Arlington's Town Hall meeting, Community Bulletin Board, a special segment on Arlington's invisible threat, and in the absence of much 55-plus news, a message from our very own Cam Pippitt. That's the show. As for social media, you can watch us on YouTube at Arlington Weekly News and the number 1, also on Facebook and on the radio at WERA 96.7 FM. Now, on to the news. As of Sunday evening, May 17th, reports show the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases had exceeded 1,500. Also in the news, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam has issued Executive Order 62, which allows Arlington and certain other Northern Virginia localities to delay entry into Phase 1 of what they call the Forward Virginia Plan to ease restrictions on certain business operations. Phase 1 will now begin after midnight on May 28th. This is based on the assumption that key health metrics will have been met by that time. Other less populated regions of Virginia will enter Phase 1 on May 15th. The much-anticipated walk-up test site for COVID-19 finally opened at the Arlington Mill Community Center. The center is located at the intersection of South Dinwiddie Street and Columbia Pike. The site is open on weekdays from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock p.m. Health insurance is not needed, but attendees should call for an appointment at 703-558-5766. The appointment line is open from 8:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m., and a doctor's order is still required. Here's a hard-to-believe item. The Arlington County Fire Department was sent to a structure fire on the 2700 block of 27th Court South on May 11th. Outdoor flames had spread from mulch to the vinyl siding and burned the plywood under the siding of the building. According to Fire Department Chief Justin Torelli, the fire was caused by improperly discarded smoking materials. No one was injured and no residents were displaced. The hard-to-believe part is that anyone is still a smoker in the year 2020. That's the news. Now it's time for the Town Hall. For some reason, this week's Arlington Town Hall meeting was pushed back to 12:30 p.m. The meeting did start fairly promptly at 12:31 p.m. Attendees included Katie Crystal, Matt DiFerranti, Jim Schwartz, Dr. Ruben Varghese, Dr. Aaron Miller, and County Manager Mark Schwartz. Katie Crystal began by acknowledging the region's relative delay in reopening in accordance with special permission granted by Governor Ralph Northam. Matt DiFerranti announced the opening of the walk-up testing facility at the Arlington Mill Community Center. He provided a phone number, but only gave it once. For people with slow reflexes, that number is 703-558-5766. Again, that's 703-558-5766. He also stated that Arlington's grant program for small businesses was still open and gave the end date for applications, but again provided it only once. And unfortunately, the website's posted deadline is Sunday, May 17th at 11:59 p.m. By the time most people hear this, it will have expired. Mr. DiFerranti did go on to provide some updates. As of the meeting date, Arlington had a total of 1,581 confirmed COVID-19 cases and 71 deaths. That's the reason the stay-at-home order remains in place. Katie Crystal then read a few questions that had come in. One was, why is the reopening being delayed? Jim Schwartz provided the simple answer, bad numbers. Dr. Ruben Varghese amplified this somewhat, saying that the hospitalization numbers were not declining at the desired rate. While there had been some improvement from 4 good or declining days out of 14 in the previous period to 9 out of 14 good days in the most recent period, the goal of 14 consecutive good days had yet to be reached. Katie Crystal read another key question. What is Arlington doing about testing? Dr. Aaron Miller responded that there were multiple considerations. First, there were the things that Arlington could do internally with their own resources. For example, it was necessary to match the right test to the need because some types of tests had failed to detect infected patients. Second, there were things that depended upon state resources, such as the testing specified for vulnerable populations like nursing homes and prisons. Third, there was the help that private providers could give. Dr. Miller did offer that Arlington had completed over 3,600 tests at the drive-up locations and that this placed it in the top 10 jurisdictions in Virginia. However, this top 10 designation would have been more meaningful if it had included the number of other rated jurisdictions and if it was related to per capita testing as opposed to just having a high population to test. Another question was, why are referrals needed to obtain testing? Dr. Miller and Dr. Varghese both agreed on a simple answer. It is both a requirement by the Virginia Department of Health and a nationwide legal standard. Dr. Varghese also pointed out that a single negative test did not provide any assurance that that patient would not be vulnerable to some future infection. Mr. DeFerrante read some other questions, starting with, what about summer camps, recreation centers, and parks? Jim Schwartz responded, the summer camp decision for Arlington will be made next week, but most of the neighboring areas have canceled summer camp for this year. Recreation centers, since they involve indoor activities, are likely to be restricted to 50% occupancy even when they are opened. And finally, a decision on the parks will have to wait until after May 28th. Mr. DeFerrante offered a pair of useful statistics. While Northern Virginia has only about 1/4 the population of Virginia statewide, they have over 1/2 of the confirmed COVID-19 cases. They are simply not doing as well as the rest of the state. Katie Crystal read a question about masks and mandates and explained that Governor Northam would be making a formal statement later that day. The question of what happens after May 28th was raised. The simple answer from Dr. Varghese was that the scientific data would be re-examined at that time and recommendations would be made even though the decision about reopening would come from elsewhere. A question arose about contact tracing. Dr. Varghese explained that it was a process that had been in place for decades and that it was used to determine who had exposed a symptomatic patient and, in turn, who that patient might have exposed before their symptoms developed. Some questioners asked about regionalism and why Arlington couldn't just work within their own data. The answer was simple. People in the D.C. metro area move around. A question about antibody testing was handled by Dr. Varghese. Although antibodies are useful in determining whether or not a patient has been exposed to COVID-19, their presence does not guarantee immunity. Someone also asked about the disruption of yard waste pickup. Mark Schwartz explained that the contractor that Arlington uses has suffered staff reductions due to the virus and that the situation was expected to be temporary. In closing, it was explained that personal responsibility was the best policy and that cloth face coverings not only protect others, but reduce the individual's inadvertent touching of their own face. The meeting ended at 1:32 p.m. Coming up next, Community Bulletin Board, or CBB. The annual Stamp Out Hunger food drive, during which postal workers would pick up donated food left beside mailboxes, has been canceled. The COVID-19 pandemic was cited as the reason. Unfortunately, this has resulted in a reduction of donations reaching the Arlington Food Assistance Center at a time when the need for food in the community is at an all-time high. However, AFAC can still pick up canned donations left in their collection boxes and will also accept donations of funds for purchase of food at wholesale prices. According to an article from our friends at Arl Now, Arlingtonians have recycled more than 1 million pounds of glass at the drop-off center since January, a new record for the period. Department of Environmental Services spokesman Peter Golkin said, "We'll likely see another million at a much faster pace for obvious reasons. ABC stores are definitely doing strong business, as are the grocery stores." The attached photograph does appear to show a preponderance of alcoholic beverage containers. We would point out that this only indicates increased consumption and disposal. The actual recycling process occurs later on. Several local restaurants have either reopened or announced plans to reopen for carryout. Whitlows on Wilson has published their new menu, which includes food such as burgers, barbecue ribs, spaghetti and chicken tenders, as well as alcoholic beverages, including beer, homemade margaritas, sangria, and mojitos. Patrons desiring a simple cola may be out of luck. No non-alcoholic beverages are listed. It was shortly after 6:00 p.m. on Tuesday, May 5th, 2020. I was walking back through Ballston, having dropped off some plastic bags for recycling at the Giant Food on Washington Boulevard, as well as some glass at the recycling depository at the intersection of Washington Boulevard and North Quincy Street. I had crossed over to Fairfax Drive for my return trip. Since the goal of that day's walk was the recycling, I did not carry any cash or coins with me. It was when I approached the 7-Eleven store at 4223 Fairfax Drive that I encountered Arlington's new, invisible threat. In the old days, he would have been described as a panhandler, a kind of minor public nuisance who was generally tolerated and occasionally appeased by generous passers-by. This particular panhandler had no pan. Instead, he held a large drink-sized paper cup in his right hand, and he rattled it softly at anyone who approached. He was about 6 feet tall and appeared to be in fairly good health. He was trim, but not gaunt. His clothes looked somewhat worn, but not ragged. He wore no face covering, despite the governor's recommendation that all residents do so. He wore no gloves. In addition, he stood immediately beside the door to the 7-Eleven, so that it was impossible for anyone entering or exiting the store to avoid coming within 3 feet of him, let alone 6 feet. My own face mask protected him from me, but there was nothing to protect him from some other unmasked person, nor to protect anyone else from him. In this situation, he could have easily already been infected with COVID-19 and could just as easily now be casually giving out free samples of the virus to anyone who passed by, especially those exiting the store. He shook his cup towards me, and I asked him what he had in there, since it could have been leftover ice from a drink. He had trouble understanding me through my mask, so I asked him again. He replied that he was collecting money for food. I replied that he had more money than I had, since I had no money with me. He was not unpleasant, and he wished me good luck. However, before I had traveled 6 feet away, he was already talking to someone else, a lady of much smaller stature. She might have been 5 feet 4 inches tall. Is it possible for a 6-foot-tall man to approach a lady some 8 inches shorter without conveying some kind of intimidation or pressure, especially when the man is asking for money? The legal term for this behavior is aggressive panhandling, a solicitation made in person for an immediate donation of money or other gratuity. A nonverbal approach, simply holding out a cup or making a gesture, is called passive panhandling. Both forms of panhandling are protected under the First Amendment as free speech. neither is illegal. It is interesting to note that soliciting for prostitution is illegal in Virginia. It is considered immaterial whether the activity being solicited actually occurs. The crime of asking is a Class 1 misdemeanor, punishable by up to 12 months in jail, a $2,500 fine, and a sexually transmitted disease blood test, although the reason a blood test is listed as punishment is not explained. In short, asking for money in exchange for sexual acts is illegal, but asking for money in exchange for nothing at all is legal. A common assumption is that panhandlers are homeless, but the Arlington County website states that, and I quote, "Most panhandlers are not homeless. Many of those we see in Arlington come from outside the county or even outside the state. For some, panhandling is a profession. Individuals can earn up to $500 a day in Arlington." Governor Northam's executive order from March 30th contains an interesting line item, paragraph 1, item E, which allows engaging in outdoor activity, including exercise, provided individuals comply with social distancing requirements. The man I observed was clearly not complying with social distancing requirements. The executive order does include Class 1 misdemeanor penalties for violations of paragraphs 2, 3, 4, and 5, but not of paragraph 1. What this means is that the man I observed is legally free to situate himself next to the 7-Eleven entrance, forcing their patrons to violate social distancing rules. He can also choose not to wear a face covering of any kind. By this behavior, he is free to contract and spread the COVID-19 virus without any legal penalties. Later, I located a distribution site from AFAC, the Arlington Food Assistance Center. It's the Central United Methodist Church, located at 4201 Fairfax Drive, a mere 2 buildings away from the 7-Eleven. Since the church has a rear entrance, it's a 2-minute walk around the building, but the food is free. Since the man at the 7-Eleven said he was collecting money for food, one remedy was just around the corner. I called the Central United Methodist Church at 703-527-8844 to ask about their hours of availability for food distribution. They said they have bag lunches available on Fridays from 5:30 a.m. to around noon, and they regularly stock some canned food in a depository by the church in the morning. However, on a Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock, it's usually empty. Is there a way for an impoverished Arlingtonian to obtain food at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening without posing a pandemic risk to himself and others, or is this a situation without a solution? This story will have to be continued at a later date. It's time for news for seniors, but there's not much to say. The 55 Plus website remains empty, and that's all we have for this week, except to continue to encourage safe behavior. In lieu of much news for seniors, we do have a message from Cam Pippitt, who is one of our people on the show and who has recently attained the wonderful age of 80. Here's Cam.
Hi, I'm Cam Pippitt, and I'm at home today because usually I am the technical director for Arlington Weekly News, but since they're not recording in the same way at the studio anymore, I'm out of that particular job. But I'm keeping myself really quite busy. There are just a lot of things to do. In fact, I think I'm busier now than I normally am. And one of the things, now that the weather is getting really nice, is I can take some really, really nice walks around in my neighborhood. That's always fun. Today is just an absolutely beautiful day, as it's been lately since this whole thing has started. The air has gotten much, much better. So I hope we can eventually figure out a way to keep the air and get rid of the virus. But at any rate, I walk around here. There's some really interesting neighborhoods in Arlington. I recommend take a look around at them. I live right next to Maywood, for example, which is a beautiful old neighborhood. In fact, I think it's probably the most beautiful neighborhood in all of Arlington. And I enjoyed taking a walk around there. They have a couple of nice parks and things like that. And there are other people walking around too. Keep my distance. So anyway, I can recommend taking walks like that. You know, I take about an hour or two a day. Other than that, I am doing such things as reading, catching up on all this old reading that I've had, sitting by my bedside for quite a while, and I finally got around to it. That I will recommend to you is this one right here called A Gentleman in Moscow, and the author is Amor Towles. I guess that's how he pronounced it. Tolez, I don't know, whatever. At any rate, it's also a book that's quite relevant because it's about a guy who during the after the Russian Revolution, he was a Russian aristocrat, and he was condemned to spend the rest of his life in the Metropolitan Hotel in Moscow, which wasn't such a bad punishment. He got to live there with some of his family, at least he got to live there with his daughter. And I won't tell you what happens at the end because well, I'm not going to create a spoiler for you. At any rate, it's extremely well written, and I highly recommend that to you. A Gentleman in Moscow. Check it out. Now, let's see, what else do we have here? I've also been watching a little bit of TV, catching up and doing this kind of stuff that normally I don't have that much time to do. And I just finished watching The Crown series in over 3 years. Excellent. Particularly, my preference was for the actors who played in the first 2 years rather than the ones who played in the last year. Fairly common. The thing won all kinds of Emmys and awards and all that sort of stuff, and that's a lot of fun. Another thing I'm watching right now is called Hollywood, which is interesting and enjoyable. It is definitely not for the children. In fact, it's not for anybody under about the age 35 or 40. It's really pretty explicit, but it's a lot of fun anyway, and it's all about old Hollywood, and it kind of has a happy Hollywood ending on it, apparently. I've only watched 6 of the 7 episodes, but we'll be getting to that perhaps tonight. Anyway, that's about it. I've been pretty busy. I also check out my grandchildren. I got 2 boys in Richmond, and I've got 2 little girls in Tunisia, and that's always fun doing Skype, this kind of thing with them. It's usually kind of chaotic and anarchistic, but when I talk to them, but that's really one of the most marvelous things. I should mention in the kind of conclusion here that I am 80 years old. Okay, when I was a kid, when I was like 15, 16 or so, I read a lot of science fiction, and often enough in those, and I really enjoyed that kind of stuff. And often enough, they would have a scene where somebody sits down in front of some kind of a television set and does a big Dick Tracy sort of a thing where they could communicate. And actually, we can do that right now. And anybody can do that who's got a computer or a telephone, and it's just the most marvelous thing. It works all the way around the world, and it is absolutely free, that's really the remarkable thing. Because when I was younger too, when I was in my 20s and 30s and so forth, working overseas, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and you were quite isolated in those days. You didn't pick up the telephone and call anybody. For one thing, most of these countries that I worked in hardly had telephone service at all, and certainly not much outside of the country. And above all, they didn't have anything like computers or Skype, what have you, to communicate. So that's about it. That's my story. And good luck to you. Keep safe and keep your distance and keep enjoying yourself. And we'll see you. Good night.
And that concludes Don Hammond's Arlington Weekly News for this week. We hope to be back next week. There certainly seems to be no shortage of news. We'll see you then. As is becoming a habit, the TV version has some 2 to 2.5 extra minutes beyond the radio version, which will fill in with some non-essential entertainment.
There's a melody verse followed by a bunch of chords. I'm just feeling my way, 'cause I still haven't found the words. It's a